Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea test-fired a multiple rocket launcher, its first test since the Stockholm talks. Pyongyang has also been pressuring Washington to come up with a new calculation ahead of the self-proclaimed year-end deadline. We'll discuss what all these mean to the denuclearization talks.
그동안 유연한 접근과 새로운 방법, 창발적인 해결책을 시사하며 기대감을 한껏 부풀게 하였으나
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, former special envoy for the six-party talks during the Bush administration. Ambassador DeTrani also served as the director of the National Counterproliferation Center. Also joining me, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks, specializing in Asia-Pacific security. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador, North Korea tested its weapon, its first in 29 days, and its first since the Stockholm talks. What do you think is the message to the United States?
Well, I think the message is pretty clear, and they've done this in the past. They're not happy. They want the U.S. to move according to their timelines, and they're putting a little pressure on the United States. This is sort of how they do business, and they've been doing business like this for a number of years. Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm. So what does North Korea want? Why is it pressuring the United States?
Look, they've come out, even with these statements from Kim Yong-chol and Kim Gae-gwan, that the U.S. by the end of this year has to come up with a new calculus to address issues with North Korea. I think issuing ultimatums like that really don't serve anyone's purpose. In fact, they could be counterproductive. I think what they're trying to do is get the U.S. to show, in their terminology, more flexibility. Give them a little more of what they want. I think North Korea wants to cut to the chase. They want the U.S. to sort of accede some playing field and accede to some of their demands.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of an old, predictable pattern that North Korea has been lapsing into increasingly in 2019 as they've not been able to get what they've sought at the negotiating table. But they're the ones responsible for not bringing more energy to the working level talks that people like Special Representative Stephen Biegun has been eager to join. And in fact, in Stockholm, it's well known, anybody who has talked to officials, that the North Koreans sabotaged those talks. That is, literally at the end of those talks, they took out the talking points and essentially trashed the United States position. And that was something they were carrying from Pyongyang. Mm-hmm. So they were paying us back for Hanoi. They were paying us back, I think, for the fact that they didn't get their way in Hanoi and that Kim Jong-un had lost some face. But the end of the year deadline is not productive, as Ambassador DeTrani says. And things like the missile launch or the rocket launch is, again, just another way to try to ratchet up pressure, to return to brinkmanship and some saber rattling. But it is totally counterproductive. It will not help them.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador DeTrani, you dealt with the North Koreans. You negotiated with them for 13 years. So them doing these missile launches and giving ultimatums, is this a show of weakness or strength? Or is North Korea growing anxious?
Well, I think they're growing anxious. I don't think it's a show of strength. I wouldn't say it's a show of weakness either. It's simply the way they do business. We have to understand, and I think we have, and certainly during the six-party talks, before we would go into plenary session meetings, they would launch a short-range ballistic missile, and you say, well, why'd you do that? Well, they say, well, they're showing the United States, South Korea, the world, that they are not sort of under the thumb of the United States, that they have capabilities, and they're improving those capabilities. For some reason, I don't understand this too well, but for some reason, North Korea thinks these summits would sort of preclude the necessity to go through working level negotiations. Well, no, these are complex issues. This requires a lot of hard work. You don't do it at summits. You do it at working level negotiations.
And Dr. Cronin, International Trade Center data shows that North Korea's exports have plummeted by 90%. It was $3 billion in 2015, but $300 million in 2018. So do you think North Korea's current behavior and actions is a show of that it is hurting economically because of the sanctions and it wants the sanctions removed?
Well, we've long heard stories about how much North Korea is being hurt by sanctions. I think one thing is clear, and that's Kim Jong-un would like sanctions relief. But that's different from saying that they're hurting so much that they're rushing toward some kind of deal or rushing away from a deal. I think it's important to say that North Korea is simply looking for the best deal they can get without giving up much. And Ambassador DeTrani is right. It needs pick and shovel work. That is, it needs real expertise, sitting around the table, painstaking work. And I fear right now that Chairman Kim will probably disrupt these talks and want another summit in order to break the deadlock. But that, unfortunately, is not going to get us the kind of detailed agreement that will be sustainable.
North Korea is constantly asking the United States to change its calculus. But looking at the previous negotiations so far, do you think U.S. is willing to change its calculus at this point?
I agree with Dr. Cronin. The summit that we had in Singapore came up with 4 points, major points, and that was I consider a Singapore joint statement. So there is a basis for having negotiations at the working level. That should be the calculus for moving on that. Now there are issues beyond those 4 points, obviously. We talked about sanctions, and they want those sanctions lifted. They want security assurances, there's no question about that. But also economic development assistance. So if those are the extra elements, if you will, to change the calculus to include actions for actions, economic development assistance, and so forth, that's to be articulated during working level negotiations. That's why you have these negotiations.
And Dr. Cronin, after the year-end deadline, some experts say North Korea may even go for nuclear testing and ICBM testing. How far do you think North Korea will go?
Well, the self-imposed deadline announced by North Korea isn't being taken too seriously, I think, in the United States. But yes, the United States will probably see North Korea go back to resuming nuclear tests and ICBM launch tests. And that's because the moratorium that they have voluntarily agreed to since the end of 2017, essentially, is the thing that they can now relinquish in the absence of progress on talks. But I don't think the United States is going to go back to fire and fury. I think the United States should be moving right now to just strengthen its deterrence posture, to strengthen its alliance posture, while keeping open the door to diplomacy and not overreacting to the fact that North Korea's systems can be built, but they can't actually be used.
And Ambassador, since there's no progress in the denuclearization talks, there are growing calls for an interim deal with North Korea. And you recently said that the United States should be resolute in going after the complete denuclearization.
Yes.
So what do you make of this idea of interim deal with North Korea?
I've always been opposed to, if you will, a freeze approach as a step towards ultimately reaching complete verifiable denuclearization. I say that because I think we could be stuck with just a freeze and not a comprehensive agreement. Look, obviously you have to halt the programs before you start moving towards dismantling programs and providing economic assistance and moving towards a normal relationship with the liaison officers, with the peace treaty, etc. But there needs to be a comprehensive agreement so you know what the end state looks like. And the process to get to the end state, starting with a halt, not a freeze, a halt, let's say to Yongbyon, and then moving accordingly to include highly enriched uranium and everything. But in a process of actions for actions, simultaneous actions, commitments for commitments, where when North Korea moves towards dismantlement, they get the benefits, whether it's a liaison office, whether it's a peace treaty, whether it's lifting of certain sanctions. That's a comprehensive agreement. And you could achieve that, as we did in the six-party process, through working level negotiations. So I think a freeze is kind of like an easy thing to do. Easy in the sense that, oh, yes, it's to be a freeze. But what about the rest? What about a comprehensive approach?
Right.
And that's what I think we need.
Yes, on that point, Dr. Cronin, what do you make of the interim deal?
Well, I think we've had a year and a half almost since Singapore, and we've seen so little progress that I cannot be optimistic that we're going to reach any kind of deal whatsoever. I think we need to sort of stop emphasizing the diplomacy from the U.S. perspective and from the U.S.-ROK and U.S.-Japan perspective, and start emphasizing the things we can work on, which is strengthening our defense posture again. We can deter North Korea. The door is going to be open. Stephen Biegun, the president, they're going to keep the door open to diplomacy. But why wait for something that's not coming from North Korea? If they can surprise us and come back with something, great. But otherwise, let's just strengthen our defense posture.
And Dr. Cronin, you mentioned Special Representative Biegun. He just got promoted to Deputy Secretary of State. Does this show that President Trump prioritizes North Korea issues so much?
Well, it's clearly one of President Trump's signature foreign policy issues. There's no doubt the fact that he's the first president to meet with a North Korean leader and to have done so 2.5 times, I suppose, in terms of summit meetings. I think it also, though, speaks very highly of Stephen Biegun's ability. He's an extraordinary foreign policy professional, very hard worker, smart. He's perfectly suited to being a Deputy Secretary of State or one day Secretary of State.
And Ambassador DeTrani, you negotiated with North Koreans so much, you know them so well. Do you think North Koreans will now put Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee as Special Representative Biegun's counterpart?
I think that would be good. She knows the U.S. well. She was intimate with the six-party process. She knows all the issues. And I would be a perfect counterpart. And I think both of them could cut to the chase and get things moving. And both have access to the ultimate leader, right?
And Dr. Cronin, the House just started formally the process to impeach President Trump. How would this impeachment process influence the denuclearization talks?
Well, it's very hard to say, but obviously if the United States becomes mired in domestic dispute, if this continues to be a highly polarized environment and focused only on internal domestic issues and the 2020 election as well, we'll be distracted. And I think it could invite miscalculation on the part of North Korea or other actors. So I worry about a big distraction, frankly, because whether the president is President Trump or somebody else, our enduring interests will continue in terms of both working with South Korea, Japan, and others, but also trying to manage down the problem, the security problem of North Korea.
Oh, well, hopefully it doesn't interfere. But there's no question about it. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of time away. But as Dr. Cronin said, our president is committed. So he's personally invested in this. And you know, it's a wise investment, because unless we peacefully resolve issues with North Korea, it's not only a question of peace on the Korean Peninsula, it's a question of a peace architecture for the whole of Northeast Asia. So it's a very, very critical issue that has to be addressed.
So before we go, I want both your opinions briefly. What needs to be done now? We don't have any progress in working level talks, and North Korea only wants summits. I mean, you emphasize working level talks so far, but what needs to be done immediately?
Well, we need to come back to the expert working table. Stephen Biegun's door is open, and he's ready to go to Stockholm or wherever to have those expert talks. And rather than to end those talks in acrimony and accusation, we need to actually just carry on in closed-door setting and spread out and talk about the 4 pillars that Ambassador DeTrani rightly underscored that came out of Singapore. It's obvious what needs to happen. The political will in Pyongyang has to be there. The will is here in Washington, but it won't always be here. You will not always have this opportunity, but it's still here if North Korea answers that call.
The way to go is to continue with the momentum from the respective leaders of coming together and working on hard issues and then getting resolutions. People are becoming fatigued with these issues after 25 years. This is a moment to move fast, because if we don't seize this opportunity, we may not have it again.
Well, we'll have to leave it here and now watch video for our next discussion.
Something that's important to the president, but I think this administration has been more aggressive in trying to pursue equitable burden sharing.
You know, really important to look at contribution that the government of Korea has, particularly with regard to Camp Humphreys.
The second round of U.S. RRK Special Measures Agreement on Defense Cost-Sharing negotiations was held from October 22nd to 24th. The U.S. is urging South Korea to contribute more of its fair share. So, Dr. Cronin, reportedly, the United States is asking South Korea to shoulder $5 billion US dollars, which is 5 times the previous amount. And in former Defense Secretary Mattis's speechwriter's memoir, Holding the Line, in that book, President Trump early in his term wanted South Korea to shoulder $60 billion US dollars a year. So what do you think is the fair share for South Korea to shoulder?
Well, there is no simple answer to that question. It's an ongoing negotiation between allies. We have to be able to manage the right distribution, the right burden sharing between South Korea and the United States. This is always something that is going to be a sensitive political issue domestically, both in South Korea and the United States. I think what's interesting here is how much more the United States is asking for all of a sudden. And I think that sharp increase is probably too much of an ask on any democratic government and ally. So there has to be some bargaining to go through and come up with the right number on this issue. But I think the United States and President Trump, they have a point that allies are going to have to do more lifting and more, frankly, resourcing of their own defense. The United States cannot do it all. And so we can reach a deal. This is about means, not ends. The fact that the United States and South Korea have been through so much together, share common values, share overlapping interests, we can settle this problem, and I feel confident the negotiators will reach a new special measures agreement for host nation support, and that we will go forward and everything will be wonderful with this relationship.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador DeTrani, do you think with President Trump, U.S. views on burden sharing has shifted fundamentally?
No, I think he's been insistent right from the get-go, certainly with all our allies. We see this with NATO, we certainly see this with the Republic of Korea, that there should be burden sharing, and that the sense that the president has had, and I think many people support that, is that maybe the U.S. has been carrying too much. So that's what negotiations are about. Certainly with our friends and our allies, that's what we need to talk about. Whether it's 800 million or 1 billion or 5 billion or 62 billion, I think the Republic of Korea, from my exposure, has been very forthcoming and has looked for that common ground with the U.S. So I think negotiations with the Republic of Korea will be successful on this issue here, because there are other overarching issues that are extremely important and even not possibly, but indeed more important than burden sharing per se, and that's bringing peace to the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Cronin, Senator Dan Sullivan told VOA that it's important to look at South Korea's contributions, especially with regards to Camp Humphreys. So what do you make of South Korea's contributions so far?
Well, there's no doubt that South Korea has provided a lot of host nation support in building the biggest U.S. base outside of the United States in Camp Humphreys. But also, South Korea has never been shy about spending money on defense, including the buy of 40 F-35 aircraft, for instance, and other systems that South Korea will be buying for their military. So I think there's a lot of contributions already coming from Seoul, but how much is enough is a question that will have to be continuously negotiated, because the United States is spending more than $700 billion a year on global defense issues. We cannot necessarily sustain that amount. So it's not just a matter of hosting some U.S. forces, 28,500 or so, in Korea. It's also about being able to keep the United States forward engaged and able to bring other power projection forces, if necessary, to a crisis. So it's very important for South Korea and the United States to settle on an equitable deal that is long-term, multi-year, and that we can make sure that the means aren't overwhelming the ends of this alliance, because as Ambassador DeTrani says, it's very important for us to think about the future of peace in Northeast Asia, and that really means dealing with North Korea.
And Ambassador, in that book of Secretary Mattis' speechwriter, he says that President Trump repeatedly asked if U.S. troops can be pulled out from South Korea. So do you think this idea is seriously being considered within the Trump administration?
No, my personal view is these are questions that seem very logical, certainly for a new president who comes in and is talking about 28,500 troops. Do we need them? These are good questions to be asked, and I think the answers he received satisfied the president in saying, yes, we do need those 28,500 troops. We do need that extended nuclear deterrence commitment to the Republic of Korea. But these are valid questions to be asked. I don't think there's any question that the U.S. military presence in South Korea is not only accepted, we all believe it's necessary. Certainly the Republic of Korea and the United States. So no, I don't think it's an issue. If we scroll back to 1977, 78, President Jimmy Carter was talking about, do we need that number of troops, and was even talking about reducing the number of troops. And the reaction there was overwhelming. No, we do need those troops there. Indeed, they're a tripwire for any potential conflict, God forbid that should ever be, with the North. So our presence, our forward presence in the Republic of Korea is very important. I don't think that's a question that's being reviewed right now as problematic.
Dr. Cronin, what are your thoughts? Is the possible withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea being seriously considered within this administration?
Well, I think President Trump has been asking that kind of business question that Ambassador DeTrani has suggested is on the minds of a lot of middle Americans who wonder, why do we have to keep paying to keep forces at that number forward, especially when South Korea is a top 12 economy in the world and North Korea is a failing economy. But the answer is because it keeps deterrence, it keeps the peace, and we have a huge stake in that. And I think that's what the president will be told by all of his advisors, and he's probably learned how important this is. Now, would the president like to see more financial support and host nation support from South Korea to make sure that we can maintain that level? I'm sure he would. At the same time, could he make some adjustments, especially if we continue negotiations with North Korea? We probably could negotiate down this number. It has been negotiated down over the years. In the 1990s, after the Cold War, and as we started to break through with North Korea, we did reduce the number of troops on the peninsula. So it is possible to adjust the number of troops, but we should not be talking about withdrawing the bulk of our troops on the peninsula. We could right-size them for the missions as they change, but it's very important for us to show engagement by being present.
Well, we'll have to end our conversation here and now move on to our next segment.
All right.
Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a photo of Kim Jong-un on a field guidance to the Yangguk County Hot Spring Resort. Chairman Kim called this spa resort a socialist architecture and a striking contrast to Mount Kumgang. He earlier ordered the removal of what he called shabby and unpleasant-looking South Korean facilities on Mount Kumgang. Dr. Cronin?
Kim Jong-un in Switzerland probably thinks that the world should be made with sort of milk and honey. I mean, Mount Kumgang was a gift essentially from the South Koreans. If he's complaining about it now, he's asking for even more gifts for nothing. I just think this is just so over the top. Kim Jong-un is living in his own little orbit. And this is not really what the North Korean people can enjoy. This is something that he and his 200 closest 35-year-old friends probably have access to.
Well, I mean, this is a pretty stark picture, to be honest with you. I mean, a jacuzzi and sort of an idyllic environment there and everything. But the reality is the reality. Mount Kumgang was invested heavily by the South Koreans. The visits there to bring the peoples together are very important, as it is with separated families. I think this is extremely idealistic, but the gap, when you're thinking about what's happening in the provinces, when you're thinking about the element of food shortages because of harvest and other humanitarian issues, to go from that to this, I mean, maybe eventually down the road, this will be available to all people. But I think it's extremely, I agree with the word idealistic. I think this is extremely idealistic. And it's kind of utopian in some ways.
Yeah, when I saw this picture, I mean, I was thinking how awkward for those people to be, for the dear leader to watch them bathing inside the hot spring spa. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr.
We'd love for them to see the TripAdvisor report. I want to see what they write down on their evaluation of the spa. Thank you.
Dr. Cronin, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.